Today I'm testing out my waterproof hardshell. Not intentionally, you understand, but I planned a hike and it just so happened that that hike went through the middle of a storm. I knew the weather was likely to be bad because the forecast for the day was up to 55-kilometre winds and rain for several hours. The weather certainly delivered on that forecast. I was hiking a new route today and was unfamiliar with the location, the route, and the usual expectations for the weather in the area, aside from the forecast for the day. But those that recognise the area might be less surprised with just how bad it was. We're up on the North Pennine Moors, heading in the direction of Crossfell via Great Dunfell. A quick check of the Wikipedia page for Great Dunfell shows that the summit spends two-thirds of the year in the clouds and has previously hosted a series of experiments into clouds. I didn't know this at the time of this recording. And in fact, whilst it was a little overcast, the hike started out relatively warm and dry. I was expecting the weather to be really bad today, so I've kind of prepared for that. In fact, I was expecting to leave the car wearing full waterproofs. I've got my cyclone trousers and jacket with me, so I was expecting it to be pretty bad, but as you can see, it's overcast, but it's dry. In the first few kilometres, it's actually underneath some tree cover in the low ground, so it's been really warm, and I think looking at where we're headed, it's going to get just a little bit colder, just a little bit more exposed. But don't worry, that did not last. In fact, after about the first 3 kilometres, I passed a sign that read, "The weather can deteriorate rapidly at this altitude. Be prepared with waterproof clothing, carry and know how to use a map and compass." I passed that sign shortly before the weather deteriorated rapidly. Getting a lot more exposed out here now. I mean, it looks great, but yeah, that wind's picking up as expected. And the rain's coming in just a little bit. Showers so far, just showers. Oh, how little I knew what I was in for when I recorded that. I think at the time I was thinking the weather was going to be a little bit worse, but I wasn't expecting it to be so darn wet. The weather actually came in pretty slowly, all things considered. From spotting the rain clouds in the distance to being surrounded by the clouds was maybe about an hour, and the first rain was quite light. So you can see here that the ground is wet, but that it wasn't exactly extreme weather, but it slowly got worse and worse as I progressed, which raises the idea of when should you stop and put waterproofs on? In particular, waterproof overtrousers. They can be a pain to take on and off, even with my cyclone trousers that I can put on without taking off my boots. I still got to fight them a little bit to get them on, and I haven't mastered putting them on without the requirement to sit on the wet ground, which is unpleasant at best. But honestly, the route felt pretty steady the whole way. The highest point was Crossfell at 893 metres, but with the total route being 27.4 kilometres, or 17 miles, I didn't really feel there was any point that was a proper climb. It was just a gradual ascent over a long distance. And here the clouds come. Up until now, I hadn't passed anyone on this route, but there was a few people out today. I think I passed about 5 people in the 8 hours I was hiking for. But just as the weather closed in, I exchanged a few words with a couple, warning that the rain was expected to last all day. But I already knew that, so it wasn't a problem. I was getting excited as I reached this road, as this is near the top of Great Dunfell, which has a radome on top. That's those giant golf ball looking radar stations. This one is supposedly used for air traffic control, and I was told that you could see it from miles away. I could barely see it from its own perimeter fence. Here is pretty much the best shot of it that I saw all day, and it quickly disappeared back into the clouds. I recorded a couple of pieces to camera here along this track, but the weather obliterated the audio, so you'll have to manage with this voiceover for now. In fact, at the worst point, the wind was so strong that I couldn't hear a passing hiker shout at me, so we just exchanged thumbs up and nods that we were doing okay and that everything was fine, and we carried on our journey. And I recorded another piece to camera here about how the clouds made this track feel like it went on for miles and miles. It was just flat stones, occasionally twisting, but mainly staying dead straight from one summit to the other. It made it feel much further than it actually was. So I lost the summit of Great Fell to the clouds, but as I approached the highest point of the day, the clouds suddenly lifted, and I could see far into the distance. Not, however, to the radome, which was still hidden by the clouds. So you won't see it as the camera pans past that summit. But the clouds lifted for the summit of Crossfell, and I was able to spend a good few minutes walking to the top, stopping for some food, with really good visibility. Thankfully, there's a decent stone structure at the top, which offered a break from the wind. But as soon as I headed back down from the summit, the weather was bad, and it got worse than before. You can see here that the cloud brought the rain. I still can't see the radome, but this time I'm soaking wet. The rain was persistent the whole journey back, and eventually penetrated my waterproofs, but I swapped out my fleece for a spare and was able to stay warm. I was actually surprised though, as I was completely wet on the outside, but still very warm on the inside for the whole way back. As long as I kept moving, I kept warm. I picked up the pace a little bit, and that helped my temperature a lot. I did worry though that a fall here would be awful. Pausing for any length of time in the high winds immediately stripped the warmth from me. I considered what I would do if things got worse, or if I caught an injury, but I just kept moving. As I dropped altitude past Knockfell, the rain became light, and I dropped through the clouds. The wind dropped too, which helped keeping warm, and eventually I made it back down to the farm, and the cows had come in, and they were sitting by the gate. The animals out here generally ignore you, even if you pass right through the middle of a group of them, which honestly is a little unnerving with animals this big. These are some pretty hefty cows. But I wondered if they were thinking the same as me, that they were just happy that the rain had eased. Back down the track to Dufton, it was a lot easier underfoot here. I passed an older couple who looked like they were headed out along the Pennine Way too, and they were dressed for the weather, but seeing me completely soaking wet after 17 miles of hiking through awful wind and rain maybe made them think again about that hike. But anyway, I made it back to the car, where I'd stashed a change of clothes, some towels, and some snacks, and it was definitely home time.